The card slid through the reader with a sharp click, then froze. Declined. Maribel's lips barely moved. Her hand trembled as she pushed the black and gold card back across the counter. "I'm sorry." The words were softer than the hiss of oil behind her. Around them, every table was filled, trays stacked high, the kitchen moving at relentless pace. Yet no chatter, no laughter, only silence so dense it felt physical. The air reeked of grease and fear. From the fryer station, Travis stood with folded arms, his stare cutting across the room. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every shift of his eyes was an unspoken command. Harlan slid a few bills onto the counter, lifted his tray, and walked to the corner booth. He did not glance around. He simply sat, his silence heavier than the noise should have been. His card had been rejected in the very house he had built. Maribel forced a smile, but her eyes betrayed her. They were hollow glassy, the kind that looked past faces rather than at them. She checked the same order once, then again, then a third time, her fingers pressing the screen as if repetition might keep her safe. A man in line shifted older, impatient. Why so slow? His tone was sharp enough to slice the silence. Maribel froze, mouth opening without words, but before she could answer, Travis lifted his head from the fryer. Just one glance. Cold, flat, surgical. The complaint died instantly. The man closed his mouth, lowered his eyes, and accepted the weight. Around him, no one moved, no one spoke. The room seemed to tighten on itself, each breath measured, each movement deliberate. Harlan sat in the corner, watching, noting how the smallest flare of frustration was crushed beneath a look. He wrote nothing yet, but the details imprinted themselves. A smile that never touched the eyes. Orders repeated until her hands shook. A customer silenced by fear, not service. Travis hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. His authority lived in a single glance, and the room obeyed. The kitchen door swung, and Jonas stumbled out. His shirt clung to him, damp with streaks of water. His hands were red skin, raw as though scrubbed against stone. He forced a grin, one corner of his mouth twitching upward, though his shoulders sagged. "I thought I was on register," he muttered, half to himself, half to no one, then louder, with brittle humor. "Part of the process, I guess." The words cracked in the air, desperate to pass for lightness, but collapsing into silence. No one replied. The workers nearby looked away, eyes on trays, on buttons, on anything but the boy. Even customers who had watched him limp across the floor shifted uneasily, choosing to ignore what they had seen. Jonas bent to collect a stack of trays, fingers trembling. He bit his lip hard enough to leave a mark. As he turned, a bottle of water appeared on the counter beside him. Eldon, the quiet cook, hadn't spoken, hadn't looked up, only slid the bottle across and returned to his work. Jonas blinked, nodded quickly, then disappeared into the rhythm of labor once more. From his booth, Harlan saw everything. A boy punished not for mistakes but for presence. No defense, no protest. Just silence pressed on every throat until it became obedience. Against the far wall hung the shift schedule. Harlan rose, slowly carrying his empty cup as cover, and paused by the board. Names and hours stretched across neat columns, every line drawn with meticulous precision. Maribel Sloane, 5 hours. But Harlan had sat here yesterday, had watched her behind the counter long past that number, her body sagging after 8. The mismatch stood out like blood on white linen. He traced the letters with his eyes. The script was too clean, too exact, not hers. Someone else's hand had carved those lies into permanence. He let the cup linger in his palm, staring longer than necessary, memorizing the detail. His pen would find the truth later, but his mind was already writing it now. Behind him, a shadow shifted. Travis leaned by the prep table arms, folded his gaze, cutting sideways, resting on Harlan for a heartbeat longer than casual. Nothing was said, no accusation voiced, but the weight of suspicion pressed through that glance like a blade sliding under the skin. Harlan moved away, calm, steady. But inside he knew the schedule on the wall was not sloppy error. It was deliberate theft pinned up in plain sight for all to read, and no one dared question. Eldon stood at the grill, broad hands steady turning patties with the same calm rhythm he had used for years. The air shimmered with heat, the scent of char clinging to his skin. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, almost ritual. Travis passed behind him, a shadow cutting through the narrow aisle. Most workers shrank when he entered their space. Eldon did not. He neither lowered his head nor quickened his pace. The spatula rose, flipped, pressed exactly as before. The quiet refusal to acknowledge fear was louder than any words. From the corner, Harlan watched closely. He opened his notebook and marked the line with careful strokes, "One who does not bend." It was small, but in a room full of bowed heads it shone like defiance carved in stone. A younger employee walked past Eldon carrying a tray. Their eyes brushed his for a second before sliding away. The kid moved faster, shoulders hunched, unwilling to share even a moment of that unflinching calm. Eldon's presence unsettled the rhythm. He was proof that silence did not have to mean submission, and for Harlan that difference mattered. The sharp crack of plastic shattered the fragile quiet. A paper cup hit the floor, water spilling across the tiles. The young worker froze, tray tilting in his hands. For a breath he looked around, desperate, waiting for help that would not come. Travis moved closer. His voice was low, heavy, each word dropping like iron. "Don't bother showing up tomorrow." No shouting, no raised tone. Just a sentence quiet enough to sound final. The boy's shoulders collapsed inward. His lips moved, "I'm sorry," but his apology dissolved before reaching anyone's ears. The kitchen stopped breathing. The hiss of oil continued steady and merciless, filling the silence Travis left behind. Maribel lowered her gaze, lashes wet, though no tear fell. She pressed her hands to the register as if bracing herself against something invisible. Harlan's pen scratched once across the page, but the weight of the moment lodged deeper than ink. One slip of the hand, one accident measured in ounces of water, and an entire future could vanish. It was not discipline, it was exile, and everyone knew it. Jonas leaned against the counter, his chest rising fast, a 5-minute pause carved out of exhaustion. He barely managed a sip of water before Travis appeared, hand closing around his shoulder with calculated force. "Break's over. Back to work." The words carried no anger, only finality. Jonas swallowed, whispering, "It's only been 3 minutes." His voice trailed into the noise of machines. Travis held his gaze. The stare was long, unblinking, deliberate. Jonas broke first. He set the cup down and returned to the register, shoulders bent, voice steadying itself for the next customer. Around them, no one lifted their head. The staff had already learned the price of defending time that was not theirs. Silence swallowed the protest whole. From his booth, Harlan saw the exchange with sharp clarity. A pause that should have belonged to a boy was stripped away as though it were theft. The pen moved in his notebook again, slower this time. Not every cruelty was loud. Some arrived in whispers, in minutes, stolen in glances that said, "You will obey, or you will disappear." Harlan sat in the corner, notebook open, pen hovering as if sketching numbers from an order. In truth, he was tracing time, when shifts began, when they should have ended, how mistakes were punished. Every detail carried weight. Every silence counted more than words. Across the room, Travis leaned against the fryer's steel edge. His arms, folded, eyes fixed. A thin smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, not warmth, but warning. He studied Harlan the way a hawk measures distance before a dive. Eldon, steady at the grill, glanced once toward the booth. His head moved in the faintest shake, slow and deliberate, a silent caution. His hands never paused. Patties flipped with perfect rhythm, but the message was clear: stop writing or risk more than paper. Harlan lifted his pen again, disguising it as absent-minded scribbling. His expression stayed blank, his body calm, but inside he felt the stare pressing closer, testing, prying. The page bore neat lines, but the truth was written elsewhere, and the suspicion coiling tighter with every glance from Travis. Maribel slid an order across the counter, her smile practiced, her voice steady. But as she turned, her phone appeared in her palm, quick and careful. She tilted the screen just enough for Harlan to glimpse the numbers. Wages. Always less than the hours she worked. A steady cut, week after week. Her lips moved, barely sound. It's always short. She tucked the phone back instantly, her eyes darting over Harlan's shoulder. Travis was walking closer, hands buried in his pockets, gaze sweeping the line with casual cruelty. Maribel's face shifted in a breath. The weary eyes vanished beneath another smile, neat and shallow, as though nothing had passed between them. She turned back to the register, tapping keys, handing out change, nodding with mechanical rhythm. From his seat, Harlan wrote nothing, but the image seared itself into memory. A stolen wage disguised as routine. A truth carried in whispers that disappeared the moment danger drew near. Her courage lasted seconds. The mask returned as Travis approached, but the glimpse had been enough. The dining room buzzed with muted movement, trays, shuffling machines beeping. Amid it, a young worker wiped down tables, his cloth sliding across plastic surfaces. He never looked up, never slowed, but as he passed Harlan's booth, his voice drifted low, almost beneath hearing. Careful. People who talk too much vanish. The words dropped like a weight into still water. No eye contact, no pause, only a sentence left behind as the boy kept walking. His shoulders never broke rhythm, his back never turned. He blended into the background as though he had never spoken at all. Harlan froze, hand tightening on his pen. His chest rose, once sharp, his pulse quickened. He looked around, but no one else had reacted. The warning hung suspended invisible, yet suffocating. The notebook remained blank on that page. What could he write? The truth was heavier than ink. In that instant, silence itself became hostile, and the threat was no longer hidden in numbers or glances. It had been spoken. It had a shape. It had teeth. Jonas wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve. His eyes were bloodshot, ringed with exhaustion, far too old for his face. He looked down at his hands, raw at the edges, nails rimmed red from scrubbing surfaces not meant for training. He whispered, voice cracking into the still air. "It's not training. It's breaking." The words were not a complaint, but a verdict spoken from somewhere deep inside his fatigue. Harlan's gaze fell to the boy's hands. The skin blistered at the knuckles, swollen around the nail beds. Marks of labor that belonged to punishment, not work. He wrote nothing, but the image cut deeper than any line of ink. Eldon stepped forward, silently sliding a small adhesive strip across the counter. His movements never faltered, the spatula still in one hand, the bandage offered by the other. Jonas accepted with a quick nod, a gratitude too heavy to say aloud. No one else spoke. No one dared. The silence pressed harder, as if the room itself agreed that the truth had been revealed. Training wasn't meant to wound. This place existed to break piece by piece until nothing was left but obedience. The tray wobbled in Maribel's hands, a tremor beginning before it left the counter. She caught it, but her lips moved anyway, whispering the apology like a reflex. "I'm sorry." The words were automatic, preemptive spilling before fault had even arrived. Travis's head turned. His eyes landed on her for a single second. No words followed, only a glance, sharp, quick, precise. The weight of it was enough. Her body tightened. Sweat slipped down her temple, glistening against the fluorescent glare. She steadied the tray, forced her hands to calm her smile, cracking, then reforming into its mask. Around her, customers averted their eyes. No one stepped forward, no one offered help. They picked at food, sipped their drinks, pretending they hadn't seen. Fear spread too easily, even across the counter. Harlan sat with fists clenched beneath the table. His nails bit into his palms as he watched her shake, watched her apologize for what never happened. He said nothing, but rage coiled silent and sharp in his chest. Fear had become instinct here. Not reaction, not warning, instinct. It lived in their bones, rehearsed in every movement until apology became as natural as breath. The grill hissed steadily, fat spitting in rhythmic pops. Eldon worked without pause, his broad frame bent, slightly shoulders glistening with heat. He didn't look at Harlan, didn't break his pace, but his voice dropped low enough to cut through the sizzle. "I've seen him take cash. 3 times." The words slid across the counter like iron, heavy and undeniable. Harlan's pen moved silently, noting the confession without lifting his head. His eyes flicked upward, once searching Eldon's face, but the cook's focus never wavered. The spatula turned, the patties hissed, the rhythm continued as though nothing had been said. The statement hung heavier for its calm. No outrage, no emphasis. Just fact, plain and brutal, spoken with the certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose. Harlan swallowed the weight of it, pressing the line into his notebook 3 times unlogged. Eldon scraped the grill clean with one swift motion, his jaw, tight eyes fixed on the flames. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The truth had already dropped solid as stone, impossible to ignore. In the silence that followed, the kitchen smelled not of food, but of theft, and Harlan knew the game reached deeper than exhaustion. It reached into pockets, into survival itself. The scrape of shoes on tile was the only warning. Travis's voice came close behind Harlan, smooth but edged. "New here. You don't look like it." Harlan lifted his head, masking the quick surge of adrenaline with a smile practiced to look harmless. He gave a false name, the kind that left no trace, spoken lightly as though it mattered little. Travis studied him in silence. The pause stretched seconds, pulling taut like wire. His eyes scanned Harlan's face, weighing every twitch, every breath. Then, with a tilt of his head, Travis stepped back. No nod, no farewell. He walked away as quietly as he had come. But the room shifted. Conversations that had barely existed thinned to nothing. The fryers hissed louder, the beeps from registers sharper. No one dared to glance toward the booth. Harlan's pulse hammered, though his face stayed calm. Travis's suspicion was no longer distant. It had a shape now, circling closer with each passing moment. The danger was no longer abstract. It was breathing behind his chair. The notebook opened again, its lined pages a refuge and a burden. Harlan's hand trembled faintly, but the strokes he laid down were firm. He wrote fear without a word. A system built on silence. Each letter carved itself into the page as if to anchor him against the weight pressing down from all sides. He paused, fingers hovering, then underlined the phrase, once a hard slash of ink. This was not chaos. It was order, designed and maintained. Silence wasn't weakness here. It was the architecture itself, built brick by brick through glances, threats, omissions. Eldon's eyes flicked toward him from the grill. They held no surprise, only gravity, as though he had long known this truth and carried it like a stone in his chest. The room remained hushed. Plates clattered quietly, shoes shuffled lightly, but the overall effect was morgue-like, the living pretending not to breathe. Harlan sat straighter, pen resting on the page. For the first time, he wasn't merely recording. He was diagnosing. The sickness wasn't Travis alone, it was the silence that had been engineered to protect him. The next day returned him to the same booth, food untouched tray cooling in front of him. He had no appetite for the meal, only for the truth playing out in fragments around him. Maribel stood at the register, shoulders sloped, every movement rehearsed to avoid mistake. Her face lifted into a smile that faltered before reaching her eyes. Jonas moved between tables, rag in hand, eyes fixed on the floor. He never looked at customers, never at coworkers. Avoidance had become his survival. Eldon remained a statue by the grill, movements steady, deliberate, as though the fire beneath the meat burned beneath his skin as well. He did not rush, did not cower, only endured. Then came the sound of Travis's steps, slow, deliberate, each footfall heavy enough to alter the air itself. He crossed the room without a word. The silence spread wider, thicker, drowning out even the fryers. Harlan marked the change instantly. This was the weight of presence, not action, not command, but existence itself, controlling the pulse of a room. No one dared to breathe too loud. Even the air bent around him. A burst of laughter broke the stillness. Two young men at a corner table, one of them unable to hold back a joke, whispered between bites. The sound was bright, careless, almost human in a room starved of it. It lasted 3 seconds. Then Travis turned his head. No movement, no sound, just the pivot of his eyes across the room. The laughter died instantly. The boy who had laughed flushed scarlet, his throat tightening as he forced down a mouthful of food too quickly. His shoulders rounded, his gaze dropped, and the weight of the stare pressed him into silence. The air around them filled with the hiss of fryers, the mechanical chirp of timers. The brief trace of life vanished as though it had never existed. The restaurant swallowed it whole, returning to its unnatural hush. From his booth, Harlan wrote a single phrase in his notebook, silence enforced. It wasn't discipline. It was orchestration. Joy had no place here, only obedience. And the method of control was simpler than words, one look, one moment, and the room returned to order. Jonas bent low, rag in hand, moving between tables with the weariness of someone twice his age. The cloth slipped from his grip, falling with a soft slap against the tile. He crouched quickly, scooping it up, words tumbling out in panic. Sorry, my fault." His voice cracked under its own speed. Travis had already turned his eyes steady, unblinking. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence carried more weight than accusation. Jonas's shoulders folded inward, his head bowing so low he nearly spoke into the floor. His fingers shook as he wrung the rag too tightly, knuckles whitening under strain. Maribel glanced sideways, lips parting slightly, but she turned away before the moment reached her. Her hands moved to the register, her face tightening back into its mask. Harlan's eyes followed every second. It was not the rag that mattered, not the clumsy accident, but the ritual that followed, automatic fear rehearsed until even a stumble became humiliation. The punishment wasn't in words. It was in being seen. Harlan rose from his booth, carrying his empty cup toward the counter with practiced casualness. He lingered near the grill, watching Eldon's hands move with mechanical patience, the spatula lifting and pressing without pause. "Burger, wait always this long?" Harlan asked, tone light, almost indifferent. Eldon's reply was flat, a riddle drained of humor. Always long, always short. His eyes never left the meat. Harlan let his hand brush the clipboard tacked to the wall beside the prep station. Columns of names, rows of hours, some written with a heavy slant, others with sharp precision. The mismatched strokes told their own story shifts, altered hours, trimmed signatures forged by hands determined to make numbers lie. His pen twitched against the margin of his notebook, but he forced it to remain still. Not here, not with eyes crawling across his back. Eldon exhaled softly, the sound heavier than words, the resignation of a man who had seen the board 1,000 times and stopped expecting fairness. Harlan walked back to his booth, but the truth clung to him. This wasn't error. It was design. The hours on the wall were more fiction than fact. The space behind Harlan darkened. Travis stood there close enough for his voice to scrape the air. "Don't think I don't see you watching." Each word landed slow, deliberate, as if testing how much weight Harlan could bear. Harlan turned his head with the easy smile of a man pretending to belong. "Just waiting for my order," he said lightly, as though nothing lay beneath. His voice carried no tremor, but the act cost him more than he let show. Travis leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. The stare stretched long, unblinking, his silence sharper than any question. The hiss of grease filled the void between them, every sound amplified by the stillness of the room. Not a single head lifted. The staff kept their eyes pinned to screens and trays. Customers chewed quickly, avoiding the shadow that reached from one man to another. Finally, Travis stepped back, the shift of his boots echoing louder than words. He left without breaking his gaze, a glance that clung like frost even after he was gone. Danger was no longer lurking. It stood inches behind his chair. Harlan returned to his booth, setting his tray down as though nothing had passed. His notebook opened again, but his pen hesitated. The moment still pressed on him, heavy and intimate. Jonas walked by with a stack of trays, shoulders hunched. Without slowing, without lifting his eyes, he murmured through tight lips, "People disappear for less." The words slipped into the air like poison gone almost before they were heard. He didn't pause, didn't look. He passed on, swallowed again by the rhythm of silent labor. Harlan froze mid-scribble, his hand tightening around the pen. He forced the words onto the page, "Disappear." Warning, Nutker 2. The ink blotched where his grip shook. From across the counter, Maribel's gaze flicked to him. Her expression stayed composed, the corners of her mouth lifting for the next customer, but her eyes betrayed her dark with worry, shadowed with fear that she too might vanish if she said too much. The walls seemed closer. Each breath tasted of warning. Silence was no longer emptiness. It was a grave waiting to be filled. In the farthest booth sat an old man, his back straight despite his years. He ate slowly with deliberate care, his eyes fixed not on his food, but on the room. When Harlan glanced over, those eyes did not dart away. They held steady, unflinching, locked onto him with quiet recognition. The difference was stark. Every other gaze here slid aside, bent under Travis's shadow. This one did not. The old man's stare was not hostile, not afraid. It was watchful. He finished his meal with unhurried precision, dabbed his mouth with a napkin, then rose. His steps were slow but purposeful, each one echoing faintly against the tile. At the door, he stopped, hand resting briefly on the frame. He turned back once, his gaze brushing across the room before settling again on Harlan. It lingered, measured, deliberate before he stepped outside. Harlan lowered his eyes, then lifted them again in a small nod. The man was gone, but the look remained heavier than words. In a place where everyone bowed their heads, one pair of eyes had not. It left Harlan with the uneasy certainty that someone else was watching the same truths he was. Harlan left the booth moments after the old man. He followed the echo of his steps through the side door, out into the narrow alley behind the restaurant. The night pressed heavy, the air damp, the hum of distant traffic muffled by brick walls. The old man stood waiting in the half-shadow, his posture straight, a faint tremor in his hands. He held a crumpled envelope, its edges worn, the paper softened from years of being carried too long. "You don't belong here," the man said, his voice low but firm. His eyes met Harlan's, steady, unwavering. And neither did I. Harlan's gaze dropped to the envelope. His hand hovered near it, but he did not take it yet. Suspicion and curiosity tangled in his chest. The silence stretched taut as wire, broken only by the faint drip of water from a rusted pipe. The old man did not move closer. He simply held the envelope out as if passing on a burden too heavy to carry alone. Harlan reached at last, his fingers brushing the brittle paper. He had not opened it, but already the weight of what it held pressed against his palm. For the first time, he wasn't alone in seeing what was wrong here. The old man tore open the envelope himself, his hands steady despite their age. He drew out a folded sheet and handed it to Harlan. The paper smelled of dust and years its corners bent ink slightly faded. It was an internal memorandum, a record of authorization. The signature at the bottom read, Sterling Voss. The letters were sharp, angular, carried authority even on yellowing paper, but the old man leaned close, his whisper cutting through the night. Forgery. I know his hand. This isn't it. Harlan stared at the page, heart quickening. He had seen enough signatures in his career to recognize the difference. The strokes here were rigid, imitated, lacking the subtle flow of authenticity. He folded the paper once more, slipping it back into the envelope, holding it tighter than before. The night seemed colder, the shadows deeper. This wasn't corruption contained in one store or one man. The rot extended higher. It wore another name, one carved on every boardroom wall, one shielded by distance and power. The truth no longer whispered. It stared him in the face, ink on paper. The old man's eyes shone faintly, moisture gathering at their edges, though his voice remained steady. Travis is just a dog, he said, the words carrying both pity and contempt. The leash is held higher. Harlan clenched the envelope tighter, his knuckles whitening as the weight of the words settled over him. A leash implied a master. The cruelty of the manager was not his own invention. It was permitted, encouraged, commanded. The old man turned his steps slow but certain, retreating into the darkness of the alley. Within seconds he was gone, swallowed by the night, leaving only the faint echo of truth behind him. Harlan stood motionless, heart drumming in his chest. His breath came uneven, not from fear alone, but from recognition. The battle he thought he faced was no longer with a single tyrant guarding a friar. It stretched upward into the polished offices where signatures carried the power to erase lives. He slipped the envelope inside his coat, each fold of paper feeling like a stone against his ribs. The silence of the alley deepened, and he understood Travis was not the end. He was the mask. The true enemy had a name, Sterling Voss. Harlan returned the next day, his posture calm, his face composed. Yet beneath the mask his eyes betrayed a restless storm. Every detail he saw carved itself sharper, the strain in voices, the weight, in glances, the rhythm of silence pulsing stronger than sound. Maribel looked up as he entered. Her eyes lingered a fraction longer than before, too long for casual recognition. Something in her gaze tested him, probed the edges of his disguise. She turned quickly back to the register, but the pause remained like a mark left in wet cement. Jonas, balancing a stack of trays, offered a crooked grin. The gesture was brave, but shallow, his hands trembling so badly the trays clattered against one another. His effort to appear normal only exposed the fear stitched deep into him. Behind the counter, Travis stood as he always did, arms crossed, body-angled gaze roaming like a predator with infinite patience. His stare brushed past Harlan once, then again, colder the second time. Eldon worked the grill with machine-like steadiness. His spatula flipped the meat with unfaltering rhythm, as though he neither saw nor cared about the currents of suspicion swirling around him. But Harlan noticed the difference. The air felt charged, like a wire pulled taut. Maribel's look had shifted. She no longer saw him as a customer. Something inside her whispered that he was more. A slip of paper fell as Harlan reached for his coat pocket, fluttering to the floor with careless weight. He bent quickly, scooping it up. For an instant, the card he carried caught the glare of the overhead light. The bold letters shone clear, Harlan West, Chief Executive Officer. Maribel's eyes widened. She saw it, unmistakable, the truth written in black against white plastic. Her body stiffened, breath caught between her lips. The world around her seemed to hold. Still, the friar's hissed registers beeped, customers shuffled, yet all of it blurred as her vision locked on the card. Harlan tucked it away swiftly, his expression unchanged, but the moment was already sealed. Maribel stood frozen, her hands hovering above the register as though time itself had broken. She said nothing. Her lips parted, but no words emerged. Her silence was heavier than speech, thick enough to choke. Across the room, Travis glanced in their direction. His eyes narrowed, searching, unaware of what had just passed between them. Harlan kept his face calm. Maribel did not. Her stillness screamed louder than a shout. The truth had slipped into the open, and there was no undoing it. Maribel lifted her gaze slowly. The change in her eyes struck deeper than words. The fear that had once owned them, fractured, replaced by something rawer, more desperate. Her look was no longer the hollow stare of a cashier. It was a plea. Her fingers clenched around a receipt, the paper crumpling as her hands shook. She held it too tightly as though the fragile slip might anchor her against the storm inside. A bead of sweat slid down her temple. She gave the smallest shake of her head, barely perceptible, then turned away. To anyone else, it meant nothing. But Harlan read the language written between her silences. He had spoken it once himself, back when fear had ruled him too. No words passed. None were needed. The message was already carved into the space between them. Help me. From his booth, Harlan sat unmoving, but inside something cracked. The boundary of customer and employee dissolved in that look. For the first time, she let him see her truth without disguise. It was not courage that made her hold his eyes. It was desperation. Silence had protected her for too long. Now, in a single glance, she risked everything to beg without speaking. And Harlan understood. Harlan returned to his booth, lowering himself slowly into the seat. He drew a breath deep enough to steady his hands, though the tremor lingered. The notebook lay open, blank lines waiting. He pressed the pen hard against the page and wrote, "Fear is visible. Silence is louder." The words bled darker than usual, the ink soaking as though the page itself understood their weight. From the grill, Eldon's eyes slid toward him. They held a quiet gravity, a warning carried without sound before he turned back to his work. His shoulders hunched as if the burden he bore had become permanent. At the register, Maribel tapped each order with deliberate care. Her lips tightened into a line, refusing to bend into the smile that customers demanded. Her face was still, but her hands betrayed the storm inside. Travis, from his post, watched it all. His gaze narrowed sharp as glass, moving from one employee to another, then landing on Harlan. It lingered too long. The air tightened until it felt breakable. Everyone sensed it. Something fragile stretched thin above their heads, waiting for the smallest spark to tear it open. Jonas appeared beside Harlan's booth with a paper cup, the ice clinking faintly inside. He placed it down with careful hands as though the sound itself might draw punishment. His voice dropped to a whisper that barely stirred the air. "Why are you here? You don't belong." The boy's eyes searched Harlan's face, but the older man only offered a slight smile, soft and unreadable. No explanation came. Silence was his only shield. Jonas's shoulders sank. He let out a breath that seemed to deflate him, the sigh of someone carrying a weight far too heavy for his years. His gaze darted toward Travis, then back to the floor as if measuring the distance between courage and disaster. He walked away without waiting for an answer, the slump of his back telling more than words could. Each step looked reluctant, dragged down by the invisible pressure that filled the restaurant. Harlan watched him go, his chest tightening. The boy saw the truth: he was different, and difference here was dangerous. The register chimed as Maribel served another customer, her smile mechanical. Then, in a motion so quick it could have been mistaken for chance, she slipped her phone out, screen already lit. She angled it, just enough for Harlan to glimpse the numbers. A bank statement, week after week, wages trimmed each short by $70. The amounts were too precise to be error. They were theft dressed as math. Her thumb flicked to another image. A photograph of the shift board. Next to her, name 5 hours. Yet Harlan had seen her work 8. Every day. Every week. Her hands trembled, the phone quivering as though even the evidence itself was afraid to exist. Her lips pressed together, a mask holding back a flood of rage and despair. Harlan gave the smallest nod, eyes locking with hers for a second that spoke more than words could. Understanding passed between them like a secret oath. The phone vanished back into her pocket. Her face reset into practiced composure, ready for the next customer. But the truth had already been shown. It wasn't a mistake, it was a system. And now he had seen it with his own eyes. Eldon approached the booth with the same steady stride he used at the grill. His expression did not shift, but his hand moved, subtly sliding something across the table. A small USB drive scratched along the edges, its surface dulled from wear. Kept this, he muttered, his eyes fixed elsewhere. Just in case. Harlan's hand closed over it, the plastic cold against his palm. Sweat dampened his skin, but he did not loosen his grip. He knew before seeing it that this was more than words, it was proof. Later, when he connected it, the images would speak without hesitation. A late-night feed, grainy yet unmistakable Travis opening the register after close scooping bills into his pocket. No log, no receipts, no explanation. The camera had caught the silence of theft better than voices ever could. Harlan's heart thudded. The air around him seemed charged, the hum of the restaurant fading to nothing as the small drive weighed heavy in his fist. It wasn't hearsay now. It was evidence. Across the room, Maribel glanced once at him, her eyes darting quickly away. The unspoken question hung between them. What will you do with it? Harlan did not answer, not even to himself. He only tightened his hold on the truth. A shadow spread across his table thicker than the light above could dispel. Harlan lifted his head to find Travis standing behind him, close enough to feel his presence. Taking notes again? The words were flat, almost casual, but they cut sharper than steel. Harlan's fingers snapped the notebook shut, the pen sliding into his pocket in one smooth motion. His lips curved into a faint smile, practiced harmless. Just passing the time, he said lightly, though his pulse thundered beneath the calm. Travis's stare lingered. A silence stretched long enough for every worker in the room to stiffen. Jonas scrubbed harder at a table that was already clean. Maribel typed at the register with unnatural precision. Eldon didn't look up at all. Finally, Travis shifted back, his gaze narrowing before he turned and walked away. The echo of his steps dragged against the tiles, leaving the tension unbroken. No one looked at Harlan, but everyone had heard. The air was frozen, the kind of cold born not of weather, but of fear. He exhaled slowly. Travis was circling closer. The mask would not hold forever. Harlan leaned back, his grip tightening around the hidden USB. Sweat collected at his temple, each drop carrying the weight of what he held. The restaurant buzzed faintly, yet every sound felt distant like echoes underwater. Then a figure passed a young employee, adjusting his name tag as he walked. He did not break stride, did not glance up, but his lips shaped words as he passed Harlan's table. Stop digging. Or you'll vanish. The message hit harder than a shout. It dissolved into the clatter of trays, into the hiss of the fryer, as if it had never been spoken. The boy disappeared into the flow of bodies, leaving behind only the chill of his warning. Harlan sat motionless, USB pressed tight in his palm, his heartbeat quick and uneven. The line between evidence and danger had collapsed into nothing. He was marked. Across the counter, Maribel's eyes flickered to him. They held no questions now, only fear sharpened to its edge. She looked away before anyone else could notice, her shoulders tense as if she too had heard the words. The third warning was no longer caution. It was a sentence waiting to be carried out. Harlan sat in stillness, breath pulled deep into his lungs as if anchoring himself against the storm he knew was coming. Before him, the faces of 3 employees flickered in his mind. Maribel, with her trembling smile, Jonas, with hands raw from punishment, Eldon, with eyes that refused to bow. Each face carved deeper into his resolve. In his hands lay the pieces of a buried truth. The USB, small yet explosive, containing images no one could dismiss. The photographs of trimmed wages, undeniable in their precision. The memorandum with a forged signature carrying the weight of names that reached beyond any kitchen wall. He opened his notebook once more, pressing ink to paper with deliberate force. The leash is higher. The words bled like confession, like prophecy. It was no longer about Travis the overseer, who ruled with silence. Travis was only the hand. The chain extended upward, coiled tight around the one who truly commanded. The room seemed to close in heavy with the realization. The battle had shifted. No longer in a restaurant stifled by grease and fear, but in offices polished with glass and marble. And Harlan knew his fight had just begun. The building rose in cold precision glass walls gleaming under sterile lights. Harlan entered without hesitation, his reflection cast back at him in polished stone. The air smelled of wealth and control, distant from the smoke and oil of the kitchens. Inside, the office stretched wide, the floor of marble reflecting a whiteness too clean to hold warmth. At the far end sat Sterling Voss. Crossed legs immaculate suit, a glass of red wine catching the light. A cigar smoldered lazily in an ashtray, its smoke coiling like a crown above him. Sterling's smile curled, deliberate, calculated. "You've been poking around," he said, his voice steady, stripped of effort. Harlan did not answer. He carried no mask this time. From his case he drew a thick folder, photos, statements, records, placing it on the glass desk that separated them. The sound was sharp, final. Sterling glanced at it, but his eyes never left Harlan's. In that silence, the confrontation was set. The kitchen was behind him, but the true fire burned here. Sterling leaned back, the chair creaking faintly under the weight of his presence. He poured another measure of wine, the crimson liquid catching the sterile light as if mocking the blood spilled in silence elsewhere. "You built this empire," he said, voice low, even tender in its false warmth. "Let me keep it alive. You take the glory. I'll take the dirt." The words dressed as generosity, but their edge was steel. He offered partnership, but the kind forged in chains. Harlan's gaze drifted to the glass of wine set before him, then rose to meet Sterling's eyes. The silence between them thickened, stretching long enough to feel eternal. Finally he spoke. One word, sharp and final, no. The refusal struck harder than a shout. Sterling's smile thinned the elegance in his posture, hardening to something darker. The room seemed to contract walls, pressing inward as if to crush the defiance just uttered. But Harlan did not flinch. His answer stood firm, a wall against the storm. For the first time, Sterling's mask trembled. Sterling leaned forward, his eyes, dark voice edged with contempt. "Silence keeps the company alive. Break it, and you break everything." Harlan opened the folder with deliberate calm. One by one, the pieces spilled onto the glass desk, pay stubs, trimmed short schedules altered in cold handwriting photographs of missing hours. Last, the USB. Proof captured in Pixel's theft performed under Travis's hand. The papers spread like wounds, torn open bleeding truth into the sterile light. Sterling's smile twisted dismissive. "Lawyers will eat this alive," he murmured. His gaze burned with the arrogance of a man convinced that wealth was armor. The air thickened, bending under the weight of two powers colliding. Harlan's evidence glared from the table, but Sterling's confidence pressed heavier like a hand at his throat. The battle was no longer about facts. It was about which truth the world would believe. The next morning, the silence shattered. Headlines burned across the city, "We serve burgers, but work like slaves." The image of Maribel's tear-streaked face filled the front page, a wound carried into every home. Sterling's name blazed beneath it. His empire cracked in the open, Travis erased from rosters as though he had never existed. But victory soured quickly. Sterling had not fallen. Lawyers crowded his side, their words sharp enough to twist facts into shadows. He denied, deflected, smoothed over every accusation with the polish of money. For the workers, it was vindication. For the world, a scandal. But for Harlan, it was unfinished. The public saw the wound, but justice was still stalled, caught between outrage and law. Triumph and bitterness shared the same breath. Truth had broken the silence, yet the fight was far from over. Maribel stood before the staff, a new badge pinned to her chest. Her voice wavered but did not break. "For once, I don't feel afraid." Eldon followed steady as stone. Leadership without fear, he said words landing firm, reshaping the room. Jonas smiled, tentative yet real, the first crack of light after endless dark. Harlan wrote the final line in his notebook. "I once stayed silent, and silence almost destroyed us. No more." Then he looked up. "Have you ever worked in fear? Leave a single dot. Thank you for staying until the end. See you in the next story."